Prominent minds would agree that George R. R. Martin needs to do some writing. I think that this is something that he would agree with, but something that he might disagree with is the amount of writing that he needs to do. Every time you go on George R. R. Martin's not a blog, it seems like he's talking about some new unfinished project that he needs to get to after I've finished The Winds of Winter. Yes, yes, of course, I'm writing, not as much as you'd like, but I'm writing, yada yada. That's the general tone of things on his not a blog, and while he does seem optimistic as to finishing The Winds of Winter at some point in the near future, we'll see it when that ends up being. But today I wanted to take a look at the other projects that he discussed that hopefully will come out after The Winds of Winter. We've seen one project be moved from after the book to before with Fire and Blood, which initially intended to be published subsequently to The Winds of Winter, but ended up coming out in 2018. Obviously, this book has not yet come out in 2024, so it did come out before. But there are a number of different projects other than A Dream of Spring that Martin has said he wants to work on in the near future. And we actually have some more details on these projects than I think that many people know. So today I'm going to be going over and analyzing each of those and what they may mean for the future of A Song of Ice and Fire and Westeros in general. But George, there's no time for that. There's no time for any of this. It's fun to explore, and I do want to look into what all of these stories might be. The first one, the big one, the one that Martin keeps mentioning, and it keeps being the reason he mentions The Winds of Winter, are the Dunk and Egg stories. Obviously, this is a big thing in many people's minds, as the Tales of Dunk and Egg are being made into a show as we speak. Filming is wrapped, and I believe the show is slated for a spring 2025 time slot, though that is obviously subject to change. Martin brings it up pretty much any time that he talks about it on his blog that, oh, I'd love to write more of these books so that they don't go away from my source material like two other shows have. But of course, after I finish The Winds of Winter, yes, yes. So we do get mentions of that more often, and we do know that there are a wide number of these stories he'd like to tell. At present, Egg is still a boy, and Martin has gone on record as saying he wants to have these stories going up until he is an adult king and even to his death. Egg's death, not Martin's. That said, it is questionable as to the pace of how these books will be finished, but it's also worth noting that there is at least one of them that is mostly finished as far as we know. So today, let's take a look at some of the examples of what these books are and what we know of the ones that are written and aren't written. The Dunk and Egg story that's yet to be published that we have the most details on is working titled The She-Wolves of Winterfell. As you might be able to tell from its name, it involves Dunk and Egg going north and dealing with a bunch of Stark intrigue that's going on. There are 5 widows and wives to Starks, or they are Starks, in Winterfell, and they are all kind of vying for control and power as the Lord, one Baron Stark, that's Beron, not Baron, was injured fighting the Ironborn. This was initially supposed to be in an anthology book of short stories called Dangerous Women, given the 5 Stark wives and widows that makes sense for fitting into there. But instead, we got The Princess and the Queen, which would become Fire and Blood, which would become House of the Dragon. So overall, I think it was a good choice for Martin to do that instead. It very much kind of broadened our view of Targaryen history, especially given that this was before the World of Ice and Fire. So it really did expand our world a little bit, but it still would have been good to get this additional Dunk and Egg story, given the fact that we will be running out after 3 seasons, it seems like, with the show. We do know one more little tidbit about the She-Wolves of Winterfell, and that is that Hodor is very likely descended from Duncan the Tall, based on George R. R. Martin's hints. Assumedly, given that this short story is going to take place in Winterfell, and Old Nan is at least somewhat related to Hodor, and Bran sees Old Nan kissing a knight that is taller than Hodor in his Weirwood flashback visions in his 3rd chapter of Dance with Dragons, it seems quite likely that we'll see Dunk father Hodor's ancestor there, which would be fun to see. I mean, at least in terms of the chronology of it. I don't think that Martin is great at writing those sorts of romantic descriptions. Also, I have very concrete information that unless you subscribe to Quinn the GM, all of these stories are going to get moved before the Winds of Winter, so I wouldn't take any chances, personally. We also know a tiny bit more about one more Dunk and Egg story, which is the next one chronologically after the She-Wolves of Winterfell. It's called The Village Hero, which very much goes in line with these books or novellas being titled after titles that Dunk has. I don't really like the title The She-Wolves of Winterfell for that reason, but I see why it would have fit into Dangerous Women. With that said, the only thing we know about The Village Hero is that it's going to take place in the Riverlands, which makes sense, given that that is an area that is constantly being ravaged by all sorts of untold horror. A lot of villages that could use use a hero there. As of 2014, Martin had stated that this was not yet written. It was just something that he had kind of vague ideas for in his head, but he did have at least somewhat of a plan, concepts of a plan on the village hero at that point, a decade ago. We do know the names of some of the future installments of Dunk and Egg, at least the concepts of names that Martin has kind of rattled off the cuff, those being the Sellsword, the Champion, the Kingsguard, and the Lord Commander. We know that the Champion might involve the trial by combat against Lord Lionel Baratheon that Sir Duncan the Tall becomes involved in later in life, but overall we have only the fewest details on those future installments. It's interesting. There is one more Dunk and Egg story we know about, but it's in a weird place chronologically. It's chronologically the second Dunk and Egg novella. It's between The Hedge Knight, which will be adapted on HBO in the spring, and The Sworn Sword, which is the second installment. We hear a little bit about the journey that's taken in a storm. I almost said a storm of swords. The Sworn Sword. Specifically, that the two of them take a road trip down to Dorne. To quote from that book, they had climbed through the Prince's Pass together and crossed the deep sands of Dorne, both red and white. A pole boat had taken them down the Greenblood into the Planky Town, where they took passage for Old Town on the galleass, the White Lady. It sounds like they spent about a year there overall, and Dunk is notably distracted searching down puppet shows. He's still infatuated by Tanselle Too-Tall, the woman who he'd fallen in love with in the first story, or at least been very interested in the first story. So it does seem interesting. We know that they did have this journey, and it was very extended, but it sounds more of a travel montage than an actual story that would get told. I think that the only reason Martin brought it up when he did was that it does chronologically take place between what would be the first season and the second season of the show, so he might want to flesh that area out or just leave it untold entirely. I think that one might be better left on the cutting room floor, personally. The inspiration for this video was a blog post about George R. R. Martin's visit to the Dunk and Egg set, because in that blog post, he detailed both the origins of this series of short stories and some of the other short stories he considered writing before landing on Dunk and Egg and their adventures. I thought this was fascinating, and all of them could be really interesting potential future installments in any short story series that Martin could do. To quote from that blog post, talking about his ideas for this short story compilation book, a Westeros story, certainly. That was the concept. It could not be a sequel, not without spoiling things I had in mind for A Clash of Kings in the later volumes. I could do a sidebar, perhaps. A standalone story featuring one of my supporting players, maybe. Robert Baratheon before he was a king, say. Barristan Selmy might do, or one of his brothers in the Kingsguard, maybe the Sword of the Morning. I could write about Robert's Rebellion, or the Ninepenny Kings, or maybe something set in the Old Town at the Citadel. I mulled all the possibilities, but in the end I decided to go back even further, to a period of Westeros history I had not yet explored at all. Virgin territory. The setting would be a tournament. I think these are fascinating because we've heard about a lot of these areas from like the world books, but those are historical texts. They're not actual short stories where we're in these characters' heads. A Robert's Rebellion or Robert Before He Was King short story from Robert Baratheon's perspective sounds like it would be super fun. I really, really would like that. I think elements of these made it their way into future A Song of Ice and Fire books. I think that his little short story about the Citadel might have ended up as Pate's prologue in A Feast for Crows. I think that initially when I read this, I thought, oh, Barristan Selmy's a short story maybe was kind of given to him in his viewpoint chapters in Dance with Dragons via flashback, and while that's certainly a possibility, my thought is he was maybe doing a sidebar in the chronology of A Song of Ice and Fire as it currently stood at that point. I can explain a little further what that means. Barristan Selmy just kind of bounces at the end of A Game of Thrones. He is dismissed by Joffrey and by Cersei from the Kingsguard, and he leaves, and he's unseen for pretty much all of A Clash of Kings. Throughout that book, there are numerous characters who are wondering, oh, I wonder where Barristan Selmy is. Oh, this guy's definitely going to crop up. He's important. He's a very respected knight, and he's going to lend legitimacy to anyone who he supports in this War of the Five Kings or any of the wars to come. Of course, we know that he later crops up with Daenerys in A Storm of Swords, but I think that his initial idea for this Barristan short story was not necessarily Barristan's past. I think it was maybe the journey between A Game of Thrones and reappearing by Daenerys' side. Maybe it was Barristan traveling from Westeros over to Essos, meeting strong Belwas, and then making their way to Dany. I think that'd be quite interesting, and I think that elements of it could have made their way in, both through Barristan's inner monologue in A Dance with Dragons and through Quentyn and Tyrion's journeys in later books, specifically A Dance with Dragons. There is one more big book that needs to be discussed before getting to A Dream of Spring, and that being Blood and Fire. This is the sequel to Fire and Blood, which is the novel upon which House of the Dragon is based. It will cover the other half of Targaryen history. By covering Targaryen history, I assume it would go up to and through Robert's Rebellion, but I don't think it would go any further than that, especially that we have some detailed accounts from any further points in history. It'd be quite interesting to see, as a lot of these elements in the World Book are kept kind of purposefully vague, because by the time that book was written, Martin was already writing these Dunk and Egg short stories. He did not want to spoil too much involving the Blackfires and the Blackfire Rebellions and the reign of Aegon V and his father Mycor, but overall I think that he might kind of be more lenient on that, given the fact that there isn't really that much time to write all of these things. So I think that Blood and Fire could be a good way to kind of summarize events that he had happening in later Dunk and Egg novels, and then potentially going back more in detail if he does have time to write those in the future. With that said, he has recently confirmed that he is actively or has actively written pages on Blood and Fire this year, which is, at least to my eye, a little concerning for the Winds of Winter, insofar as, I mean, Blood and Fire might take after Fire and Blood and get moved before the Winds of Winter, but at present, I don't think that's going to happen, knock on wood. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps grow the channel, and I do really appreciate it. It feels good to see support on things that I'm making. I really appreciate any comments as well. Let me know what you think of these books. Are you looking forward to any of them in particular? I'd love to hear your opinions, and yeah, I'll have many more A Song of Ice and Fire videos in the near future. I plan on covering the Dunk and Egg television series once that comes out, which I am pumped for, and I hope you are too. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day, /week, /month, /year, /decade, / however long it'll take for Winds to come out.